Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to reassemble the Yamaha YL1 carburetors. I'm going to reassemble the left carburetor real time on this video. The right carburetor, I'll speed up the video as it's a duplicate of the one I'm going to show you, so I won't show that in its entirety. But before we get to assembly, I want to talk a little bit about the parts that I am going to replace on these carbs. And if you recall from the video when I disassembled the carbs, the one problem I had with the left carburetor was this pilot jet that you can see right here. And even though it's probably usable, you can see that the slot for the screwdriver got banged up a little bit, and it was already damaged when I started on it. So I did order a new Mikuni brand jet that you can see right here. This is an original OEM part, and it is the correct specification for this carburetor. This Mikuni jet cost me about $4, by the way. It was not expensive at all. The float bowl screws, you can see the originals right here. I'm replacing with brand new Kawasaki part numbers. These are the exact same screw. The only difference between the new ones and the originals is the originals look like they have a zinc dichromate finish on them, that gold color. The new ones, the Kawasaki parts, look like they're just zinc plated. I'm not concerned about that. And of course I got new float bowl gaskets. These are still available from Yamaha, you can see right here. I have prepped the float bowl gasket by pre-coating it with anti-seize. You may have heard me talk about using anti-seize on gaskets before, so I won't go through that in any real detail in this video. In terms of assembly of the carburetors, it's a pretty straightforward process actually, with the possible exception of two items. One is adjusting the float height and the locking tab for the enricher jet linkage. Those two items can get a little bit fiddly, but other than that, it's just a matter of assembly. And there's not as many parts involved as it might appear. It's not as intimidating, rather, as it might appear. I usually start on the inside and work out. Again, the process that you choose to use isn't terribly critical, as long as you make sure you get all the inside parts on before you put the float bowl on. Also, I've cleaned these carburetors in some detail that I've talked about in previous videos, so I'm not going to duplicate that conversation. Suffice it to say, these carburetors, both of them, have been thoroughly cleaned multiple times inside and out. We're going to begin disassembly with the pilot jet. That's that new part I had bought recently to replace the one that had been damaged earlier. I'm going to just use a little 3-in-1 oil and just put a couple of drops of oil in there. I typically don't assemble pilot jets dry. And just thread it in. Now when you seat a pilot jet, don't overdo it. You don't need to reef down on it. You just want to make sure it's good and seated. Like that. Now that we've got the pilot jet installed, the next thing I'm going to install is the needle jet, or the fuel valve. And the reason I'm going to do that is this sits at an angle. I don't know if you can see that there. It sits at an angle like that. And it'll make it a little easier to use tools to get in there and get at that without having the main jet holder in the way. You can do it, but it's just easier if you install the needle valve first. This is the original needle valve that came out of the bike. It's been cleaned, and I did test it earlier as I had talked about to make sure it doesn't leak. So the valve and the needle are original to this bike. So now I'm just going to thread that in with my nut driver. Just gently snug it up. Main jet holder goes in. Just a little bit of oil in that. That'll thread in there, and again I'm just gently snug it up. And then the main jet itself oil. You can use any oil for that. I just use 3-in-1 because it's lightweight. Snug that up. Next thing we now need to do is install the float mechanism. Again, I cleaned these floats, both floats, in a previous video, so I'm not going to duplicate that conversation here. You can perhaps see right there, where that point is, where the original needle valve had contacted the bottom of the float tab. What we're going to do at this point is I'm going to install the needle itself. You don't want to forget that. Make sure it's clean. There's no debris or contamination. Fits in. And I'm going to place the float in place like this for that contact point for the needle valve button right there. It's lined up. Just the pin. You can put oil on this if you want. I usually don't. We can't get this in here easily. There. There you can see the floats installed. I'm going to check the float level right now. On this bike, let me get out the Yamaha documentation. On this bike, since this carburetor is a VM15, the float height is approximately 23 millimeters. And I'll show you how I'm going to measure that. I'm going to use a dial caliper and set it to 23 millimeters. That's on this scale, by the way, right here, millimeters. So there's 23 millimeter. And lock it in place. And I'm going to use the extension here on the end of the caliper to measure and see where my float height is. Now this is as I took it apart and cleaned it, so I haven't really checked it because I haven't put it together yet. But we're going to check from the base of the gasket surface, which is right there, where that pencil point is, to the top of the float. And we're going to say, or bottom of the float as the case may be. So I'm just going to tilt this float ever so gently, just so it stops. Take my caliper, and forgive me if my head gets in the way because I've got to see this. I'm going to see where my float height is. I don't know if you can see that or not. I'm trying to show you. It's a little bit high, it looks like. Probably a millimeter plus. I'm trying not to tilt the float too much so that it messes up the reading. I don't know if you can see that or not, but you'll have to take my word for it. It's probably 1.5, maybe 2 millimeters. In this case, too high, or there's a gap between the float and the bottom of the caliper where my thumb is. I'll check it on the other side here and see what this says. Yeah, same thing. So that means I'm going to have to take the float out and I'm going to have to adjust the tab to move the float height. Now since the float is too far that way, what I'm going to do is move this tab in the opposite direction, and I got to gently bend that tab right there. So I'm just going to take a pair of fairly fine needle nose pliers, slip it over the tab, and I'm going to bend this tab in the opposite direction just a little bit. It usually doesn't take a lot, and you might have to do this a handful of times before you get it where you want it. That's pretty normal. Oh, pin fell out. Make sure the needle's still in there. Let's check our float height. Again, I haven't moved the caliper. It's still set at 23 millimeters. And we're pretty close right there. I don't know if you can see that or not. We are very, very close. It's not unusual to have a little bit of variation in reading between the two floats because they're not necessarily soldered square to the bracket that's mounted to the pin. So I usually, as long as they're in the ballpark, I don't worry about that too much. But boy, that particular float is right on the button. I'm going to call that good enough. 23 millimeters. Move on to installing the new float bowl gasket. Again, this has been pre-coated with anti-seize. The reason I use anti-seize, it just makes it easier to get it apart in the future if you need to. So we're just going to slip that down over. You can see how the hole in the gasket aligns with that tube, that brass tube. And before we button up the bottom of the carburetor, one last look to make sure we've got everything in place. Pilot jet, main jet holder, needle valve or fuel valve, height adjusted on the float. Now it's going to be a matter of assembling this float bowl back onto the carburetor. You can see the cutout here where my thumb is, where there's a notch cut in there. That fits over this section where the float pin pivot is. So this will go like that, and you can see one of these holes here will line up with this brass tube as well. So I typically will do it like this. And now we'll go ahead and add the hold down screws. Little anti-seize again. Just a touch on each screw. And we're going to snug those screws up with a JIS, Japanese Industrial Standard screwdriver. I'm not going to tighten them down all the way initially. I'm just going to get them in place and get them started. And then I'm going to tighten them in a crisscross pattern. So we've got the bottom end of the carburetor all done. Now we're going to move on to completing the top end. I think the first thing I'm going to do is put in the air screw. That's what this screw is, with the smaller of the two springs. There's two springs. One is for the slide adjustment mechanism. The smaller of the two goes on the air screw. And the air screw will go into the side of the carburetor right there. Again, a couple of drops of oil on the threads. Spring. And then the air screw will go in. Now this is set at, according to the Yamaha documentation, 2.5 turns out from seated. I'm just going to seat it gently right there. And I'm going to count out 2.5 turns. 1/2, 1, 1 1/2, 2, 2 1/2. And that'll be my starting point for the air screw. I think we're going to put on next, assemble the slide mechanism and its various components. Make sure they're clean. They should be. There's a couple different pieces that go with the slide mechanism. Let me see if I can't get these out here. The slide itself, almost forgot the needle. The needle right here is original. It was set correctly at the middle or the third position, which is, according to Yamaha specification, is a stock setting. And the deeper of the two cavities, you can see there's a deeper cavity here. This cavity is deeper than on this side. That's the inside. So I'm going to begin by just dropping the needle down the middle hole. And you can see the little circlip that will prevent it from falling through. Then what we're going to have is a clip. See that clip right there? And that's just a press fit on the inside. Like that. Let me get a little screwdriver here and I'll push it down. I don't know if you can see that there or not. But that clip right there fits down over the top of that needle and presses into place. And you can move it if you need to like that, because I want to clear these holes. And so you can move the needle around as you need to, or move the clip rather around as you need to make sure you clear those holes, because those two of those holes are important. Next thing we're going to put in place is going to be the spring. Now this spring maintains downward pressure on the slide to return it to a neutral position or idle when the bike is running. You can see one of the legs of the spring is turned up, actually on both sides. I think you can see that. And that spring is going to fit right down into one of those legs, into that little hole right there in the slide. We're going to fit that down like that and press it down all the way. That holds that whole needle assembly and clip in place. You'll notice there's a little bit of a hole right here. That's where this top leg of the spring fits in, like that. Now the slide in relationship to the cap here is specific. This notch right here you see on the side of the slide, and this part of this cap here that's got a little leg on it eventually will be aligned like that. You'll see why in a moment here. But right now, the first thing I'm going to do is take this pin, and this pin is going to fit into the recessed or countersunk cavity. You can see right there where it's pointing to. And that's where that head will fit down into, like that. So I'm going to slide that in, that pin, and I'm going to rotate this assembly until this notch, my left pointer, and the cutout in the side of the slide align like that, approximately. Then slide that pin right up and through. And then compress it with the assembly with my left hand. And now I'm going to take this adjusting screw with the spring on it, slide it down over the top, hold this assembly up, hold it down, slide it down over the top, and thread it in. I got to put that back together like that. I'm going to thread it in quite a ways because there's a small cotter pin, cotter key, split key right there that will go through the hole in the pin and hold that in location. This is one of the originals, by the way. You can see like that. So there's our assembly. This is designed to allow adjustments in tension, how much tension you want, and where you want to position the slide for idle purposes. So now that I got the cotter or split pin in place, I'm just going to open the legs up a bit. And now we have the slide assembly complete. This other fitting with the nut on it is where the cable from the throttle grip will come down into and eventually end up down in here, and we'll talk about that at another time. I'm going to put a little oil on that. I should have put a little oil on that, but it slipped my mind. I was doing it. I'm just going to thread that on. Like you see there. So that assembly now is ready to go back on the carburetor. I'm going to set that aside for now. Now we're going to go ahead and assemble the starter jet, the enricher circuit, into the body of the carburetor. This is one of the little more fiddly operations on this project because we have to get the orientation of the 4 parts in the right order. We have a locking washer. It has a tab right there that you can see that's bent up. That fits into, if I can find it here, fits into that notch. So that tab will fit there. With the plunger itself, of course, and then we have this bracket which actually holds the starter plunger in either the up or the down position. And you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. I'm going to start with the intake side. This is the engine side of the carburetor body facing me. This then would be the air cleaner side. And I'm going to add a little oil here to the starter plunger, both the threads and the plunger itself, as you can see. First thing that goes on is this bracket. And again, this bracket is to hold the plunger in a fixed position. And we're going to put it on like this with that bend facing up, like that. Then we're going to put on the locking tab with this bent tab down, as you can see there. Then we're going to take the bracket itself, the actuator bracket, which is going to fit on the carburetor like that, and we're going to assemble this together. Now I'm going to take the bracket and hold the finger tab to the left, and I'm going to take the starter plunger, and this gets a little bit fiddly here. I've got to fit this all together at the same time, so I've got to fit it down like that. This bend here in this one bracket will have to go something like that, and then the fingers here at the top slip underneath that ridge on the top of the starter circuit. So I've got to get this just in the right position here. Give me a second to get this together. Like I said, it's a little bit fiddly. Get it just right. There. I think you can see how I've got that assembled. Now this whole assembly is going to attach right here into this threaded boss. Like, let me get this turned around, like that. So I think now you can see the orientation. Now it's important to make sure that that locking tab, which is on the bottom of this little stack of parts here, that leg that's bent down fits into the bracket, and I can tell that it is by the way it fits and the fact that I know that this bent up portion right here would be aligned on this side. Now it's just a matter of tightening everything up. I tighten as far as I can with the fingers because I don't have a thin profile wrench to get in there, which I should have, but I don't. Also note that the way this bracket is arranged right here, that raised section is bent up needs to interact like you can see there. See how that works? Now I'll just take my 12 millimeter wrench and snug this nut up. There. Now I've got to bend that tab up. Before I bend that tab up, I want to make sure that the mechanism is working the way it's supposed to. And it is. It seems to be fine. So now I'm going to take a flat-bladed screwdriver, put it right up against that, and smack it with a hammer just enough to flex that tab up against that flat of the nut. Got to do this without blocking your view if I can. I think you can see that right there. Beautiful. I'll just take my needle nose and snug it up. Oh, fuzz. And I think you can see how that's supposed to work. Last thing we need to do on this carburetor is install the, or I'm going to do anyway, is install the slide mechanism. It could be left off at this point because it's going to have to come off again later to put the throttle cable on. But I'm going to go ahead and complete this assembly. I'm going to put the cap over the top. This notch in the side aligns with a pin down in there, which also aligns with this cutout right here, this notch. So it'll go something like that. I'm going to turn this cap around so that those two components align, like you can see there, approximately. And then tighten the cap up. And we have the left carburetor appreciably done. I'm going to leave the bracket that connects the two carburetors together. There's a rod that goes across the top here. I'll leave that off for now, and I'll put that on after I put the carburetors on the engine. So I'm going to consider this carburetor appreciably done. I'm going to move on now to the right carburetor. I'm not going to show all the steps. And what I do show, I'll speed up, just so you get a sense of what I'm doing, but it'll be the exact same thing we just did. Well, there you have it. I got the two carburetors finished and ready to go back on the bike. This is the bar, the linkage bar that goes between the carburetors that we'll talk about in more detail when I go to install the carburetors on the bike. But I think I got them done. That's going to be it for this video, folks. Any issues, questions, thoughts, please leave me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.